Gemini 9, 1966, we didn't know a lot about walking in space. We didn't know a lot until after we'd done it. Spacewalking some 28 years ago when I was outside the spacecraft on Gemini 9 was truly a unique experience. You know, all the doctors thought that we're going to get space euphoria, and when we see the Earth travel below us at 17,000 miles an hour, somehow we're going to feel like we're falling out of the sky. That wasn't true at all. Your home is your spacecraft. You are moving only relative to your spacecraft, in spite of the fact that you're both satellites moving around the Earth. And it's when you lose sight of that home, your major senses all disappear except perhaps for what you see and maybe what you feel. But feel in zero gravity is so different. When I was out, the first part of my EVA was to sort of do an umbilical test, see what kind of dynamics, how did a human being, when he was just floating freely in space, feel, and what could he do to control his actions. And it was comfortable enough until you'd lose sight of the spacecraft. You'd roll and tumble and twist. In zero gravity, you have 6 degrees of freedom. You move up, down, left, right. You can roll, pitch, do all those things. And then all of a sudden you'd be in the spacecraft and you were almost frozen, in the spacesuit, and you're almost frozen in a spacesuit because of the stiffness of the suit under pressurized conditions. And all of a sudden you'd come to an end of an umbilical and you'd feel a tug, something pulled on you. The problem is, unless it pulled right through your center of mass, center of gravity, it now not only started reversing your direction, you go back to the spacecraft, but you'd start tumbling and you start rolling. And the most uncomfortable thing was you'd look around for the spacecraft, my Gemini spacecraft. That was a reference. And if you saw it, you then realized where you were. But if you didn't, you talk, the cliche, being lost in space for a moment or two on the end of that umbilical, unless you could see that a spacecraft when you're rolling and tumbling, you really were lost in space. Now, it wasn't that I didn't feel uncomfortable. I just felt, to a degree, somewhat helpless. But then the latter part of my flight was going to be a step into the future almost, because I was going to fly a backpack, I call it a Buck Rogers backpack. Real flame and smoke coming out of the thrusters that were not only going to stabilize me and keep me from rolling, were going to propel me forward or up or down, and I could go then where I wanted, when I wanted. And it was going to be a true test, perhaps maybe way ahead of its time as we look back. The backpack I was going to fly on the end of a 100-foot tether actually had fire coming out of its little rocket jets, and as a result, I had to wear steel pants. So when I'm out there, the fire wouldn't have burned a hole in my suit, and of course I'd lose all pressure, whereas later on we use nitrogen, inert gases. And we didn't know a lot about Newton's laws of motions. When you push something, it pushes back. And when I tried to turn a valve to assemble this backpack, remember, Gemini was so small that the backpack was outside, and I had to work in a vacuum. I had to work in daytime and nighttime, and I had to work in a pressure suit. The Gemini pressure suits were sort of like they sprayed you with some plaster of Paris. They were very difficult to move. So when I had to turn a valve or depress a handle to assemble this backpack, which I finally got into, I had sort of exhausted myself, and I had overpowered the cooling system, and my visor got all fogged up. I can remember sitting in the back of the Gemini, strapped in. I was breathing the oxygen from the backpack. I was disassociated from the spacecraft, except that I was still hooked in. Stafford had a button he could push to allow me to go out and fly around. And I can remember at nighttime seeing the lights of Australia. I had to take my nose and sort of put a little hole in the visor so I could literally see through the fog. It was a very interesting moment to be out there by yourself under those circumstances. And of course, always was a problem. It's like a carrier landing. The flight's never over until you land back aboard ship. The Gemini EVA was never over until you got back in the hatch, because the spacecraft was so small. We were relatively big, and with the suit even bigger, and you had to crumple up your legs and get them under the instrument panel. And then in my case, Stafford we had a special hand grip where he could pull the hatch, literally almost crushed me on the head so we could pressurize. And then as you pressurize, your suit got depressurized, it got softer. But we all knew that getting back in, I think Ed White had a problem, and that was a cue, and we had trained a great deal to get back in, would be a problem. There were some things you never talked about, the kind of things you legislated out, the kind of things that you didn't train for. You mentally had crossed your mind occasionally, but it was what would happen during the Gemini EVAs if you couldn't get back in. And get back in that Gemini spacecraft was a real bear. We were big, we were in pressure suits. It was a small hatch to get in. I remember having to bend my knees and putting them under the panel, and Stafford had to close the hatch on my head just to get in so we could depressurize. But that was one of the things you didn't talk about, although you knew without talking to each other about it that was going to have to be the way it was. Stafford would have had to come in without me. And the other thing was, people want to know, what would you have done? Did you ever think about not being able to get off the moon, and what would you have done? And yes, it crossed my mind before I went, crossed my mind once or twice while I was on the surface, but it's the kind of thing you legislate out. Were we prepared to stay there? Did we have any pill or whatever? And the answer to that is no. Did I train for what I was going to do if I couldn't get off? Absolutely no. We just had enough confidence in our hardware and in our own abilities to sort of legislate it out of the plan. You know, this is 1966, almost 30 years ago, and it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that Tom told me a conversation he had with Deke in that little trailer we dressed in down by Pad 19 down at Cape Canaveral before we got on top of that Titan rocket. And Tom, in his own way, said, "Gino," he said, "you ever wonder what Deke and I were talking about when we were getting suited up that day before we flew on Gemini 9? And I said, "Well, Tom, I thought of it, but I never really," I said, "I maybe really thought I knew, but I wanted to ignore what you might have been talking about." He said, "Well, you're right." He said, we were figuring out what Stafford would do if you couldn't get back in." And he said, Deke said, "Tom, you don't have any choice but to pull an umbilical and, leave Gene up there if for some reason he can't get back in." And I said, "Tom, somehow," I said, "it's nice to talk about it now. It's nice to reflect about those things now, and we laugh about them over a beer. But I said, somehow, that I know that I knew what you and Deke were talking about. That's one of those unwritten rules. That's one of the risks that you take because it's worth it." And we sort of had, it was the same kind of unwritten rule we had about the lunar surface. People always were concerned and wondered. To this day, I get asked this question all the time. Did you ever, besides were you scared? How did you feel? What did it look like? They want to know if you ever thought about not getting back or not getting off the lunar surface. And my stock answer to that is I didn't go to be a martyr. I didn't go not to come back. And indeed, that's true. And in every moment, just taking and squeezing the gloves of that suit was tremendous effort. It required a lot of energy. And during that period of, I was out a little more than 2.5 hours. But very early on, it was pretty obvious that my heart rates were high. I was expending a lot of energy and perspiring. As a matter of fact, in 3 days, and I think I can confine it to 3 hours, 3 days of the Gemini flight, 3 hours of the EVA, I lost 13 pounds. That's an awful lot of weight. And I think probably 95% of it was just liquids, was just water, because when we finally landed and I got into Earth gravity, full gravity on board the recovery ship, still in my spacesuit, I could feel my feet sloshing around in water, and I was in about 3 inches of water up to my ankles that had just accumulated from the perspiration and from the effort of working during the spacewalk. We were cooled only by oxygen flowing over our suit. Unlike from Gemini 9 came the water cooling garment, so forth, which helps tremendously on the moon. But all we had was a small breeze, if you will, a breeze coming over our head and over our body. Obviously, it was not capable of absorbing a kind of heat that the human being, at least I was able to put out. And I think subsequent flights like Mike Collins and Dick Gordon had very similar problems. And I ended up with 100% humidity in my suit, and my entire visor got completely fogged over. So here I am, 300 miles above the surface of the Earth, 17,000 plus miles an hour, sitting in the back of the spacecraft. Now remember, Tom's inside, and he was only 10 or 15 feet away, but he might have been light years away at that point in time. We were talking to each other, but he couldn't help me. There was absolutely no way he could have come out and helped me had I gotten into a problem. And we were flying through the daytime passes and the nighttime passes as we circled the Earth. When I was actually prepared and got everything finally ready to fly, and was literally breathing the oxygen from the backpack, I was on an electrical system, on a communication system. I really was able then to take my first, quote, breather and sit down, if you will, and relaxed while we thought about where we should go from here. And it was a moment of reckoning for me, because it was during a night pass over Australia, and here I am in a totally fogged up, like a wintertime windshield of an automobile, fogged up visor. And I didn't really ask myself, what's a nice guy like you doing in a place like this at that moment, but I'm not sure I didn't think about it. But I kept thinking, here I am. Spaceflight in those days was unique, because very seldom do we ever get in a position, whether it's on a lunar surface or in the case of Gemini 9, where we know that the next thing we do, good or bad, is going to be history, unique history. The problem would have come when I was going to try and doff or take off this backpack. The plan was for me to hold on to a bar on the front of the Gemini with one hand, and then try and unbuckle these buckles, and, more difficult, unplug these oxygen and electrical connectors. And again, every time you have to press or even, any kind of actions always are going to create a reaction. And I don't know, we'll never know. I don't know how much problem, or if I could have done it at all. If I'd gotten so tired that and we weren't sure how quickly we can recover in that environment either. But had I gotten so tired, I knew that yet ahead of me, I had a major physical exercise coming of just getting in the spacecraft. And I tell you, when I finally got in, I don't know that I've ever been as exhausted, physically exhausted, physically drained, probably dehydration as well, in my entire life. Certainly not up until then, and probably not since then, quite frankly. The saw separation plane from the booster in the spacecraft ended up with big knife-edged saw blades on it, and if I'd ever lost sight of those saw blades and sort of floated out from behind there and they'd cut across my back, Tom Stafford would not have had to worry about bringing me home. I was involved in those early days, as all my colleagues were, in one of the most competitive programs that I think it evolved, but that could be created for anybody. But it was a unique competitive program. It was totally non-political as far as I'm concerned. It was just based upon effort and merit and perhaps being in the right place at the right time. But we'd compete on a very friendly, very open basis with each other for every space seat that was available on any flight, on any spacecraft, anywhere. And yet, once a guy got assigned to that flight, or a group of guys got assigned to flight, that competition served to be the greatest support for the success of that mission and those guys who were flying it. It was a very unique environment to be working in, and one that I think you'd find hard to duplicate. To be the first man on the moon was the primary goal of each and every individual. We all wanted to land on the moon. There were things that were probably, after my first flight to the moon on Apollo 10, may surprise you, and if you want to ask me about it, I'll be glad to talk about it. They were more important than actually landing on the moon. I don't know, it's difficult to imagine. Take Mike Collins, for instance. He was part of the first flight to the moon, first landing on the moon, and he didn't land on the moon. And yet he is as much a part of that crew as anybody. And yet in the back of his mind, he came so close and didn't quite make it. And there were other guys later on who maybe only made one flight in the entire days they were in the space program, who got a chance to be one of those 12 people who walked on the moon. And whether we like it or not, whether it's good or bad, whether it's right or wrong, people do separate, quote, those people who actually touched the moon versus those people who only went to the moon. That really isn't fair, but it just happens to be a fact. We had taken in less than a decade mankind to the threshold of really space exploration, to looking over the edge and seeing what's out there. And sure, I knew that I would be the last man of Apollo to walk on the moon, and it might be as long as 10 or 15 or 20 years. But truly, when I left the surface, I believed then, and I believe now, someone will be back someday, maybe not in my lifetime, to where I actually landed. But that we go back to the moon. But more importantly, at that time, I thought by the turn of the century that we would be on our way to Mars. And I said the turn of the century because I said, my God, that's 30 years from now. Certainly we can do that in 30 years. We've got the capability to go if we start right now. And we used to call our flight not the end, but the end of the beginning. We didn't know at that time that that beginning might be not only a generation, but perhaps 2 generations in coming. I often look back at Apollo, you know, considering where we are a quarter century later and where we might be in a quarter century from now, and look at it in terms of talking about going into space 200, 300 miles away from home and living for 7 or 10 or 14 or in space station for much longer periods of time. You know, we've already been to another planet in our universe. We've already traveled in a 250,000 miles away. When we talk about seeing the Earth and our star from 200 or 300 miles, that doesn't hold a candle to looking at it from 250,000. And I often look back and wonder whether or not Apollo may well not have come before its time. Maybe Apollo should have come in the next generation or 2. We did it. We said we could do it. We did it. We came back, and then we were looking for something else to do as a nation, in effect. And we haven't yet found it. We certainly haven't found it in space. The shuttle is the most sophisticated flying machine man has ever taken into the skies. And yet, it doesn't generate much interest. It doesn't generate much excitement. And quite frankly, it just doesn't do a great deal at this point in time. Maybe we didn't realize the significance of what we were doing, of what we were involved in. And I think NASA themselves, and perhaps the astronauts included, were too selfish at that point in time to give to the American public. Something that they craved for was the answers to, Neil, what's it like? What did it look like? How do you feel? And all the things they can identify with, all the personal feelings and senses. They wanted to be there. They wanted to take a flight. 3/4 of them would have been too scared to go. The others didn't have the chance, and we were those few, quote, chosen few. Now tell us about it. And we never told any. Oh, we did. We had our week in a barrel, and we give a speech here and a speech here only because we had to. I was one of those guys who was somewhat vocal about the fact that we just ought to give something to the people so that they could become part of it. Had we done that, I think we would have, sure, after Apollo 11, the interest would have dropped, but there would have been a strong constituency of interest that carried on through the entire space program. And I don't know, at least through the Apollo program, I don't know whether the public reacts to the press's interest or the press's interest reacts to what they think the public is interested into, and maybe it's a little bit of both, but certainly it dropped off. Quite frankly, it didn't bother me personally at all from the standpoint of what I was doing. I didn't need to tell somebody how important and how much I believed in what I was doing and how, and even today, I don't know that we can really look back and, we can talk about the technology, all the things that Apollo brought to us, and there's many things that's a totally another subject. It may be 100 years from now before we truly realize the significance of Apollo itself. And so at that time, I think all of us just felt that we had a chance to do something no one had ever done before, and let's get on with it and do it. I didn't feel any personal disenchantment or disappointment that the public was not beckoning at my door. And yet, on every space flight during those days, your yard would be filled with television trucks, and you'd be on the front page of every newspaper, or you'd be, the on the evening news at night. And of course, once it was over, even your flight, not just Apollo 11 carried on. And here we are 25 years later talking about the accomplishments of a quarter century ago, primarily the accomplishments of Apollo 11, because that was, quote, the first. So there is interest, perhaps more even today than there was then. There was a place on the moon that we called home. It was a valley surrounded by mountains that are higher than the Grand Canyon is deep, to give you some perspective. We stood in sunlight looking at the beauty, the overpowering beauty of this earth, the multicolors of the blues and the oceans and the whites and the snow and the clouds, looking at it from 250,000 miles away through the blackness of space. It itself, the earth itself, surrounded by the blackest black you can conceive in your mind. Stood in sunlight on the moon looking at the earth surrounded by blackness. Not darkness, blackness. That's a paradox, but it's also truth. When you're there, you have to ask yourself, fully appreciate where you are at that moment in space and time and history, and quite honestly, you don't. But you look at that Earth. It's revolving on an axis, because you go about your business, and 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours later, instead of looking from the eastern shores of North and South America, the continents of North and South America, across their countryside and their plains and their mountains to the deep dark blues of the Pacific Ocean, you might now be looking at the entire continent of Australia, and soon thereafter Asia and Europe and then all of Africa. You realize the Earth is rotated on an axis you can't see, but that must be there. You watch the sunset on the east coast of one continent and watch it rise on the east coast of another continent. It's not like looking through or across distance. It's like looking across time, and the Earth truly is your identity with reality from a place on the moon where reality itself is almost like a dream. That's probably the most vivid description I can give of being on it. And you look at the Earth, and it seems to have every right to move aimlessly and tumble through space, but it doesn't. It moves with purpose, it moves with logic, and to me, and I've had a chance to challenge this feeling not just once but twice, it's just too beautiful to have happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than you and bigger than me, no matter how we dress them or by what name we call them, that put the small part of the universe together that this one person was privileged to see. Well, I guess officially the last words spoken on the moon were when I went up the ladder and I said, "We now leave, as we once came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and with hope for all mankind." Now, the unofficial words are about 10 seconds before Jack Schmitt and I lifted off in our lunar module to rendezvous with Ron Evans. And we had gone through the checklist so many times. We were so ready to go. Of course, the engine hadn't lit yet, and that was a real key. And I just looked over at Jack and I said, "Jack, let's get this mother out of here." And we were on our way.